Hello, I'm Gunnar Knapp, Interim Director and Professor of Economics at the University of Alaska Anchorage Institute of Social and Economic Research, or ISER. On June 14, 2013, federal government officials held a roundtable discussion on the national strategy for the Arctic region at the University of Alaska Anchorage. The roundtable discussion was moderated by Fran Ulmer, Chair of the Arctic Research Commission. Fran asked me to provide the officials with a very brief introduction to the Alaska economy. This is the presentation that I gave them.
Hi everyone. My name is Gunnar Knapp. I'm Interim Director of the Institute of Social and Economic Research here at UAA, and welcome all of you to Alaska, to Anchorage, and to UAA. I know that it's an impossible task to introduce Alaska or the Alaska economy in 5 minutes. Fran asked me to speak briefly to try to make a few points that might be helpful to our visitors here in sort of understanding Alaska and what we are and how we work and what's driving our economy. The things I'll say today, I'm sure everybody here could find another 5 minutes of equally important things to say. And with that, I'm going to stand over here and talk mostly to these folks. I think most of the folks in the room know everything that I'll be saying. I think people tend to think of the Alaska economy in terms of resource industries, and certainly resource industries are extremely important. But if you look at what people in Alaska actually do, there's all the support industries that actually employ a larger share of the people, and like in the rest of the economy, sort of an increasingly large share of the economy in Alaska as in the rest of the country. You're here in Anchorage, Alaska, a wonderful town, beautiful weather like this all the time, big tall skyscrapers, high standard of living, very much part of modern American economy. And this is very much part of Alaska, contrary to popular belief beyond here. And matter of fact, places like Anchorage and Fairbanks dominate the statistics for the Alaska economy. But it's also very important to remember that there's another part of Alaska's economy, rural Alaska, and in particular western Alaska, northwest Alaska. It's an extremely different situation, completely the opposite from urban Alaska. And I think this is one, and the gentleman earlier spoke about the honey buckets and so on. This is the paradox of Alaska, of a wealthy state with also some of the poorest areas in America combined. And both of these parts of Alaska's economy, the modern and the rural and poor, are very much affected by what happens in the Arctic and very much affected by what happens with U.S. Arctic policy. Very briefly, to remind you about Alaska, here's a map of our state. Most of the population is concentrated here in south central Alaska, where we are, and Fairbanks and in Juneau. And on the other hand, we have hundreds of small, scattered villages and regional centers in the west and in the rural areas. Again, very different types of Alaska. This, I think, is a useful picture to look at for all of us when we look at the world and Alaska. And you can see development in Alaska. Where do you see the lights? Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Prudhoe Bay. And that reminds us that's where the people live, and that's where the industrial part of Alaska's economy is. And the rest is very, very undeveloped, even by standards, say, of the western United States, and particularly compared to most of the state. You can't, unless you've been here and traveled around, you can't fathom how remote and undeveloped and pristine so much of Alaska is. It's useful to realize, why is Alaska so remote and undeveloped? And part of it is, as shown by these maps, Alaska's climate and topography. It's a cold place. Everybody's talking about the ice is melting in the summer, but in the winter, large parts of Alaska are all frozen up, and you can't get there. You can't ship stuff in. It enormously adds to costs of transportation. Then we've got our topography and the permafrost, which you're very aware of. A fundamental other feature of Alaska that's important to understand is Alaska land ownership. The federal government owns 59% of Alaska. This drastically affects what kind of economic development takes place and is allowed to take place. And large areas of federal lands are withdrawn for various purposes, and development is limited to various extents. This very dramatically affects Alaska's economy and is very central to sort of Alaska Arctic policy. So what's our Alaska economy based on? And my colleague Scott Goldsmith has estimated that it's roughly 1/3 driven by the petroleum sector, by oil, and 1/3 by the federal government, and everything else, all the other industries, such as basic industries such as mining and tourism and commercial fishing, are responsible for the third part. And so the critical point that I would make to you today is that oil and the federal government are incredibly important to our economy, and both oil and the federal government, for different reasons, we face concerns about where they're going in the future. This is another way of looking at the role of oil in the federal government. This shows sort of what are the contributions to Alaska's gross state product, and the federal government shown there in yellow at the bottom, and oil extraction shown in red. The second thing, you might say, well, it's just 1/3. But the federal government is so much more, because the federal spending that supports everything from the native health care system to grants for research at the university, just pervasive throughout the economy. And then the oil industry supports almost all of state and local government in Alaska, and then also has all kinds of capital spending that also comes into the economy. So the oil and federal government are incredibly important to us. But when we look at oil production in Alaska, this is probably one of the most important graphs for anybody in Alaska to understand, as well as our visitors. Our oil production, North Slope oil production, has been declining dramatically for many years. We're down to barely 1/4 of what it was at its peak. And so there's a lot of concern in Alaska about this decline in oil production, both for a technical reason and for an economic reason. The technical reason relates to the challenge of operating the Trans-Alaska Pipeline with diminished throughput, and the economic reason derives from our dramatic dependence on oil revenues to drive our Alaska economy. And this graph shows the state of Alaska's general fund revenues, and you can see that the red, the share that's oil revenues, is overwhelmingly what supports state government. Now, it's a very interesting graph to look at, because you see from the early 80s on, we experienced declining oil revenues, which reflected both declining oil prices and declining oil production at that time. Well, the oil production has kept on declining, but the oil prices rose dramatically, and so we've experienced a renewed boom over the past 10 years in Alaska in terms of our oil revenues. However, it won't matter what the oil prices are if our oil production declines. So Alaskans are extremely concerned about getting more oil production, and this is where federal policy in the Arctic is critical to the future of our economy, or one of many ways. And now I want to go to another point, the dramatic difference between, this is the point I rose at the beginning, between what my colleagues call remote rural Alaska and the other Alaska. We're here in the other Alaska with these nice buildings and roads and plumbing and all this stuff. And that's where something like 2/3 or 3/4 of Alaska's population lives in this other Alaska, urban, south central, Fairbanks, and so on. The other parts of Alaska are vastly less developed, and they are overwhelmingly Alaska native in terms of population. And here we see, with the exception of the North Slope Borough, which is a very special case, which I don't have time to go into today, and has benefited so hugely from the from the oil development that's occurred up there. In many of these other parts of remote rural Alaska, and in particular in the Arctic and in the coast of the Bering Sea, which is very much within the purview of Arctic policy, we have not only the poorest places in Alaska, but some of the poorest places in the nation. And you see this in all kinds of statistics, such as the percentage of families receiving public assistance, the percentage of kids receiving school lunches, and a dozen other statistics I could show you if I had time, which I don't. In rural Alaska, the economy is very highly dependent on government sources, and subsistence plays an extremely important role in the economy, in a complicated mixed cash and subsistence economy. And federal policy is extremely important, obviously, for both of these. For the government support to that rural area, and for example, in dealing with the issues such as the honey buckets, and in managing the subsistence. So Arctic policy is vital to these rural areas. And this is my final slide. I would say that Alaska's economic future is directly linked to U.S. Arctic policy in many, many ways. You'll hear this from Alaskans emphasizing various of these. It's related in terms of infrastructure development, which completely affects the kind of resource development that can occur. It's in the oil and gas development policy. It's in other resource development policy. It's in Arctic transportation. It's in the military bases and spending. It's the federal fisheries management. It's the rural Alaska programs. So what you are doing, your subject matter, is incredibly important to our Alaska economy, which is why you have so many people here saying what you are doing matters and we want to be involved. Thank you.